My name is Eric McKinnon. I'm the head of revenue here at Wynter, and I'm going to be off your screen momentarily, I promise, because I have a fantastic guest for you today. I'm pleased to introduce Dev Basu, who's the CEO of Powered by Search. You can see him here. For over 15 years, Dev's been in the trenches, helping to turn underperforming B2B SaaS marketing into a well-oiled growth machine. Dev's not the type of guy who's going to deal in fluff or quick fixes. Predictable growth methodologies he's developed has helped companies scale by design and not by accident. The really great news for those of you who are here is Dev is going to take on one of marketing's toughest challenges for us today, which is reaching DevOps teams. As I'm sure you can all appreciate, DevOps folks and developers, they are very good at running things like ad blockers and making sure they stay out of the public sphere when it comes to places that we're going to advertise to them and chase them around. And they love talking about us in dark social places like Hacker News, which I am a huge fan of. So Dev's going to break down how to get through and cut through to DevOps teams, make sure that your message is reaching them, but also how to do it properly and make sure that you're not going to kill your credibility in the process. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Dev. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will be back for the Q&A. Folks, as a housekeeping item, if you have questions, please make sure you ask them in the chat or in the Q&A section inside of SQL here, and then we will come back to them once Dev is finished, and we will answer those questions for you in a back and forth. We'll see you then. Take care.
Eric, thanks for having me. I always like to shout out some of the folks who come in live into these sessions early because you're the keeners. I see Christy, Christian, Ann, Gary, James, Jonathan, Ellen, Victoria, Brad, Bree, Tamar, Lucas, Jesse, Alex, Afan, Perseus, and Tapesh. You're all here, and we're going to learn together. We're going to roll up our proverbial sleeves and learn how to market to DevOps teams specifically. Everybody from individual contributor, software engineers and developers, up to the ops teams that have people managers or people wranglers, and even up to leadership. And so if you're thinking about the C-level that signs off on big technology investments, how to get into everything from CI and CD to build and test and deploy to logging, for example, as well. I'm going to be talking through all of the entire DevOps lifecycle because these people are notoriously hard to reach. They're skeptical of marketing in general, and the traditional B2B playbook does not work. We have been doing this work for over 15 years, working with names and brands that you probably know and trust. Everybody from public companies like Elastic to private equity-backed companies like TestRail, small startups like Rainforest QA, for example, and even titans like VMware. And so made all the mistakes really in the book and learned from it because we approached DevOps marketing like B2B traditional marketing and got slapped in the face as that ended up happening. We learned pretty quickly. And so my team and I have adapted an approach that really does work for reaching developers and DevOps teams, whether at the individual contributor level, whether at the senior level. What I would love to do to make this the most useful hour in your day is understand a little bit more about what type of product are you trying to market to DevOps teams. Drop that into the chat. So if it's an observability solution, type in observability. If it's logging, if it's CI/CD, just type that into the chat. And so the question is, what type of product are you trying to market to reach DevOps teams specifically? Let's get some conversation basically in there going. I'll shut you out as you start putting that into the chat. If it's cloud optimization, if it's headless CMS, if it's something related to build, test, deploy, log, monitor, I just want to see what that is as you put that into the chat. I'm seeing a couple of people putting their answers in here. Zach says CI/CD. James says runtime security. Yep, we've got clients who do cybersecurity training and runtime security as well. Gary says JSON database. Andrew says IT disaster recovery. We've got a client called Fortra that does that. Bree does observability. We've worked in that as well. Disaster recovery says Tapesh. Perseus says virtual waiting room. That's cool. Love seeing that. Tamar says software development management. So you're the right people. You're in the right room right now to talk about how to be able to get to the end audience over here. And we're going to be diving into the hardest parts of this. We're going to be talking through the big problems that happen, the mistakes that are causing those problems, what better looks like. And if you could imagine a different world where your marketing was more predictable and you did grow as a result of the actions you take. A lot of people think about the key performance indicators, KPIs. We're big on a different term that you may not have heard before, KPAs, key performance actions. So what are the actions you need to take to get the results, the KPIs that you actually want to hit? Because you have to behave your way towards your goals. And we'll talk about exactly how to get there as well. I see a couple more people coming here. Jonathan says data platform. Christy says digital security. We're going to dive right in. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen. You should see a slightly different way of presenting this content. I don't really do slides. I like to draw, and drawing out ideas helps me think better and hopefully reach you and connect with the different parts of your brain a little bit better as well. And so as we dive into this, the question is how to market to DevOps teams. Really, I think that the first place to focus on is what is the DevOps marketing dilemma, if you will. The first aspect of this is if you think about the types of ways that these problems basically arise. Let's start off with what people normally do. They run ads. If you are running ads with your DevOps marketing approach right now, trying to reach developers and DevOps teams, type in ads into the chat so I know that that's something that you have tried. If you have run any kind of paid ads, paid social, paid search, display, put that in. Zach says ads. Tamar says ads. Great. So you're seeing some people running ads. The second thing that we see people do is, of course, they try creating content. The content can go in a bunch of different places. It can be technical documentation content. It could be on your blog, for example. It can be on product and feature pages specifically. It could be on integrations pages. So if you're running ads, let's see if a few of us over here in the room are running ads. Percy, Christy, Tamar, Zach, you're all running ads. Now, if you're doing content as part of your marketing approach to reach DevOps teams, type in content. I want to understand what kind of content. You can go as far as saying we're big on a blog, or we're big on technical content, docs pages, for example. Christy says all of that plus emails. James says content as well. Lovely. So you're doing content as well. The other thing that we see that the teams that work on this create is they have a nurture sequence. So Christy, you mentioned all that plus emails, and then lead capture is something we see that marketers try. And by that I broadly mean webinars, gated content, gated case studies, gated technical documentation, for example. But if you are putting a form on your lead capture, which is essentially to get an anonymous person who's on the side of the other screen to say that they're a John Doe or Jane Doe and fill out a form, become part of some sort of database, whether that's a CRM or marketing automation platform. We see a lot of that as well. And of course, there's issues that happen with all of this type of content. So if you have you might have some sort of technical diagram over here, you have content over here, you certainly are doing ads to get a bunch of clicks. And usually those ads are going to be related to some sort of performance objective. So increasing trials, increasing signups, requesting demos, depending on the type of motion that you're basically going in with. Jonathan says that he does a blog, technical content with ads for additional reach as well. Now let's talk about the problems with each one of these. If you think about the way that ads are created, there's a lot of wasted ad spend that we see. In fact, we see anywhere between 20 to 40 cents wasted ad spend is someone clicks the ad, does not engage on the post-click experience, meaning they don't actually stick around on the landing page. They don't fill out the form that you're sending them to, which is a direct response type of form, and then they bounce. And so the ads broadly get ignored. And so if you're trying to draw the line over here, you might be doing that. Unfortunately, it's getting ignored. Now, if it is content, what's the issue with that? Credibility is the big challenge with content. So if you create content and it's shallow or it's perceived as being shallow, then you end up having a credibility issue, right? And then on the lead capture side, you have a different kind of problem, and that, of course, is that you're instead of filling your funnel and getting lots of leads that you can then start nurturing and start inviting into trials, signups, into activation flows, for example, you basically hear crickets, right? And so these are the core problems that we want to solve for in this traditional playbook, for example. I'm kind of curious. I want you to type in one, two, or three, depending on if you're only having one of these problems, two, or all three of these problems right now. Put that into the chat just to see where is it hurting for you right now in your current marketing approach. So Christy says three. All three of these are problems for her. Gary says three, and we should see some common threads over here. I actually expect to see more threes and twos than ones, essentially. James says two, Afan says three. And so it's difficult. It's a tough business to try and make this happen, because when you are creating these approaches where instead of, the things that we really want at the end of the day are, if you have ads and content, and lead capture, you end up basically building people will know who you are. If you have content and lead capture, they will like who you are. And if you have ads and lead capture and they actually fill out the form, then you have no like and trust. And of course, at the middle of that is the proverbial pipeline that you're basically trying to get in front of. But this is the key problem, which is if you approach it the same way that you might approach typical traditional B2B marketing. For example, we have clients that are business oriented clients. What I mean by that is they're not trying to get in front of a technical audience. Clients like Basecamp, for example, that's selling project management software, no problem, or Toggle time tracking software. Those clients and the types of customers they're trying to reach, these particular approaches work just fine. Unfortunately, when you are trying to market to developers, what ends up happening is you end up getting these challenges around, your marketing being ignored, your, pipeline having crickets, and then having a real credibility problem as well. So literally, you can turn off your audience from being able to really dive in and learn about the content. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about, the typical, traditional awareness matrix. We actually built this back in the pandemic, and it's been one of our probably most downloaded, most referenced pieces of content that we created. And we wanted to match the speed at which buyers want to buy. Now, developers and DevOps teams they're still humans at the end of the day, just like anybody else. I mean, we think about B2B versus B2C, but it's still a person on the other side of the screen buying your stuff. And so that person typically goes through the same levels of awareness that anyone else basically goes through. It's just that they elect to buy differently if they're a more technical buyer, meaning they have more agency or more higher need for, I need to figure this out for myself without talking to somebody else. I definitely don't want to talk to sales teams. I don't want to deal with friction. So don't make me jump through hoops to get to the information that I need. And let me play with it myself and then make up my own mind as to whether I want to go deeper. Whereas if you are more of a business user, you know what, you're okay with filling out a form, like being on a webinar, having a conversation with somebody in sales. And we just like to buy slightly differently between technical versus business audiences or non-technical audiences. What we're seeing over here is what I call a B2B, a traditional B2B awareness matrix. And I'll kind of draw your attention to, how to think about this. So basically, people go through 4 different levels of awareness. And not just about a product, by the way. This is just about a category. So if you didn't know that there were, let's talk about what's happening in AI right now. And if you were trying to build an AI solution and you had a database issue, you just didn't know what kind of database to really integrate with, what's popular. I might know that Supabase, for example, right now is what a lot of developers are preferring, especially if they're using some sort of AI, IDE, for example, like Cursor, right? Natural integration with Supabase, with the production environment, and something like Netlify, for example. But if you didn't know those things and you were a B2B buyer, you might go in and say, well, I'm unaware. The ways that I'm going to figure this out is I'll read books, I'll read articles, I'll do quizzes. None of that works with developers. It just doesn't, And if that's different for you and you're like, this does work, I've actually seen quizzes work for developers, I want to learn from you. But I can tell you that these things, which work typically for non-technical buyers, especially in this unaware segment, don't work. Problem aware. So now if you bridge from there to here, checklists, guides, webinars and templates as content format types, regardless of the channels that you drive from, they don't also work either, frankly. As you get into solution aware, meaning if someone knows what problem they want to solve for, and then they want to go over into their solution aware at this point in time, there are a few things that work. Calculators can work, deeper down the funnel if you're trying to essentially size up the problem. So I'm looking through a few of you over here who would put in the types of things you do. So for example, if you're selling digital security, we have a number of cybersecurity clients. We do a risk assessment, which still is vetted by a technical buyer, but often the person who shows up on the demo is more like a business or non-technical buyer. They may have had a technical background, but as they have moved up in management overall, they behave a little bit more like a non-technical buyer. They still respond to numbers and data at the end of the day. So for example, we have a file security client. And one of the things that we do with a calculator approach for them is an input is, let's actually figure out what is the scope and size of your file security problem. It's got ultimately to do with how many files do you actually have, how many do you know exist, and how many are shadow, for example. And so calculators can work. That's okay. Well, let's talk about what doesn't work. Product choice guides don't work. Scorecards don't work. Buying guides don't really work because these are all seemingly assisted, meaning like you're trying to guide and narrow down the user to where they want to go. But because DevOps teams and developers in general want so much personal autonomy and agency, they want to play with it essentially themselves. They don't actually go about appreciating this type of content. So then you get into this section over here, which is product aware content. And certainly case studies work, but they don't work if you gate them. Use case pages work quite well, and we'll talk about specifically how to type of content, what is content, code samples, docs, for example, which are all a variant of use case pages. Comparison pages work as well because they help the end buyer save time. And then any sort of ROI calculator works specifically for DevOps teams in general because if you think about sort of developer plus ops, the ops bit really comes in with the three things that all software really sells. This is a writer downer. We think that from a positioning standpoint, every single piece of software sells three things. They sell speed, so automation essentially instead of friction, certainty, so predictability as opposed to a flip of a coin, random acts of whatever kind of work that your platform basically sells, and insight. So being able to take disparate data and turn it into some sort of insight. That's effectively what an observability platform is doing, is taking a bunch of different kinds of data and saying, now we're going to give you a BI dashboard that tells you exactly what to look out for and what to look for and what to look out for based off certain triggers and alerts, for example. I'll just kind of pause here. These are, this is what makes the typical B2B marketing world go around. And the way that we would typically work through it is to work from the product aware content, because these people are the closest to actually signing up for a trial or a demo. And what we do is we say, tackle that first, then this, and then that, basically. So it looks like a Zorro kind of, we work backwards with the end in mind specifically. I just want to see if this is helpful so far, because we're going to talk about everything that doesn't work, which is what we just did. And we're going to shift gears to what will work for and what does work specifically for DevOps teams. But just as a frame of reference, if this is helpful so far, drop yes into the chat so I know this is resonating for you. And then we'll keep jamming, basically. Alongside, if you have questions that start popping up, put that into the chat as well. And what we're going to see, towards the end of this particular session is being able to have a nice Q&A back as well. So I see James, Lisa, Tamar, Christy, Steve, Afan all saying, yes, this is resonating. That lovely. Love to hear that. Let's keep, trucking along to the three big mistakes that we see happening. So we generally know, I think it's a truism that you cannot market to developers and DevOps teams the same way that you would market to non-technical users. I don't think I need to convince you about that. You probably have found that out in your own marketing approaches, because earlier in this particular session, you talked about those three different problems that we covered. And certainly if you're watching this, on demand, you might be nodding along right now saying, yeah, I've got those three problems basically as well. One thing that we notice over here is there are some big mistakes, which is, sometimes what we see marketers come to the conclusion of is just paid ads don't work. And so what they do is they abandon ads. They just say, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just not going to focus at all on ads. We're going to go all in on technical content. And so then they just create only tech documentation. And they go on these year-long type of exercises. We're working with a cybersecurity company that went through a cybersecurity 101 kind of content hub that they created. And it's got every sort of article. What is CM? What is CNAP? What is, insert acronym basically over here. They spent a whole year working on this. And then they came to us. And the reason they came to us is because they got traffic, but they got no conversions. And most of that traffic ended up bouncing away anyways, because a lot of the times the types of people who are looking for what is and then a term are usually they're more junior in their careers, and or they might be tangential to the actual ideal customer profile that you're trying to reach. Meaning people who are in the know, who are actually deep in their craft, don't typically look for that. They look for how-to content, but you might be, getting the what is content in front of people who are gatekeepers or influencers, for example. They might be part of a buying committee. And certainly we see that in ops and leadership. But if you're doing this purely for developers, it's not going to resonate. So if you only do technical documentation, if you completely abandon ads, we see that as a mistake. And then, of course, gating content, right? This is a typical approach where if we see transferable skills coming in from a marketer where they work with a lot of B2B marketing, but not technical audiences specifically, they say, hey, why don't we try it? Let's gate some of our content, including the case studies, perhaps, including the calculators. And, what they really are trying to optimize for is let's basically focus on the word MQLs. I want to see if that's actually true for you. Are you guys focused on MQLs as a North Star metric? If that's you in your business right now, or if there are people who think about that or talk about that, put in MQLs into the chat just so we can define what that looks like for you and put a different spin on it basically as well. So Bree says she cares about SQLs, sales qualified leads, people who are requesting demos. Christy says both MQLs and SQLs. And so we're certainly treating this, and I see this a lot, where if you have sales teams in, technical organizations, or you have marketers who are adapting to a technical buyer, essentially, they try to bring the playbook from a non-technical audience into this developer ops. Now we play in both, we're, broadly B2B SaaS essentially focused. And so we get to see a lot of product-led growth. We get to see sales-led growth. We get to see technical audiences and non-technical audiences as well. So I think we're, fairly agnostic. We just go, we got to meet the buyer where they're at and speak the language that they care about at the end of the day. Lisa says MQLs and gated content is a religion over here. So thank you for speaking that truth, because we're going to talk about sort of the pros and cons of that. And then SR says, we don't gate content. We tried it once and it was a wasted effort. And so what we're going to end up seeing is a sort of normal distribution in terms of works for some people. If you're in the edge cases, for most people in the messy middle, what ends up happening is, if you think about this as a normal distribution, the folks at the 20% of folks over here and here, they might end up saying, it was a waste. And then over here, it's religion, right? But for the most part, we would see that the people in the middle over here, they find it difficult. It's just tough go, basically, how they go about that process. So one of the things that is in the resources section, I mocked this up yesterday, especially for you guys, is what would it look like to have a different kind of engagement metrics that was purely for DevOps? And I'll walk you through each one of these areas essentially. But it's the same matrix, but not for B2B buyers. It's for technical buyers, essentially. I'll walk you through the core areas. And so we're talking primarily about the types of messaging that you want to get in front of a technical buyer. But then we also talk about when to do it and where to do it as well. And so if that be helpful, we can dive right in. Let's first dive into the product aware content. So if you're thinking about product aware, things that really make a difference are having really well done API docs. And the reason for that is because it is the closest thing to somebody actually trying your product. when they need to understand, how do I integrate with you? That's their jobs to be done. And so most of you probably have API docs. If you were to look at it and start really thinking about where you could enrich it even more, that's where you can actually end up having a non-linear amount of increase in conversions to signups or to demo, for example. In other words, the more robust your API documentation basically is, the better it'll actually work. And so, especially if you're more at the startup-y type of stage, what we notice API documentation to be is it's a little bit shallower. It's got the basics, but it's not really robust at that point in time. So one way of being able to know how to make this more robust, especially if you're in the marketing role and you're not really writing the API docs, technical writers in your organization are thinking about that, is we think about asking existing customers. If you have product managers that you work with or product marketers that you work with, they can help you identify where there are gaps, basically. So, if you think about sort of a scale of 1 to 10, grade your API docs essentially and say, here's where we can go in and start. If you don't have them, create them. If you have them, make them better, essentially. The next level up from that is our code samples. And so this is one level beyond just how do I integrate with you? It's really how do I plug and play? That's the jobs to be done that the developer ops teams are really looking at, which is, can I just copy this code and start essentially appropriating it into my use case overall? Knowledge base is an important component of this as well. And I'll tell you the main mistake that we see a lot of. And then I would encourage you not to have ads completely turned off. Especially if you're in a marketing role, you should advocate for this. You might face some resistance from non-marketing roles in your organization, but it's pretty important actually to have ads, especially for the purpose of recall. And so we think about paid search ads, retargeting and remarketing over here, not purely as a conversion tool, but really to keep top of mind overall. And so if you aren't doing these things, these are the closest things to money that you can do to create more pipeline, which is, again, robust API docs, increase your code samples, make sure you have at least retargeting and remarketing on, and then make sure you have a robust knowledge base. Now, I mentioned an open loop over there, which is, what is the number one mistake that we see in knowledge base content? And the knowledge base content, the big mistake we see is that there are no CTAs back to sign up. If that's you, type in me into the chat. And here's how that works from a workflow perspective. Typically, you, the marketer, are not writing content on your knowledge base. You're working with some technical writing team internally or externally to create that particular content. That content is created for existing users. It's not created for new customers, new prospects, or new users. And as a result, when you read it, it looks like a how-to, but once you're actually using your app or your platform. As a result, technical writers aren't taught. They don't think about actually saying, well, what if somebody reads this content, but they're not an existing user? And the simplest thing that you can do over there is at the bottom and in the actual content, link back to a call to action that says, if you aren't a user of insert your name right now, right, in your app name, your platform name, start a free trial today. And if you want to sweeten the pot, if you have the ability to increase your trial length, increase your freemium limit, for example, talk to a sales engineer instead of talking to an account executive, do that, because these particular areas over here are the biggest areas where you can have lift for the smallest amount of effort. It's almost always what we do in our first 90 days going into this, right? And so let's see over here if you are doing this. So actually, if you aren't adding CTAs into your knowledge base, because most of you will have a knowledge base, type in me into the chat. Just gonna wait for that. Just ME, simple. If you have a knowledge base, but you don't have call to actions to link back to signups, and there you go. By the way, this is, when I say put that in, we're just kind of building this together, because the best way to be able to build this up is, once I'm going to give you the simplest tactical thing that you can go ahead and do. It's going to have the highest lift. And I see Gary, David, Scott, Lisa, Victoria, SR, James, and Olivia all saying me. You guys don't have call to actions in your knowledge base. And so SR says, again, can you expand on this? So here's what I mean. When you have a knowledge base article, you have multiple articles in your knowledge base. You might have 50 of them. what I'm asking you to do is go into these articles, which, by the way, often will outrank your marketing website. So they sit on docs dot whatever your domain name.com is, or knowledge base, or kb dot your domain name.com. And when you go into that, insert a little yellow box or a high contrast box that simply says, if you're not a user of insert your app name over here, sign up for a free trial today and put this use case into practice. And it's essentially all it is doing, it's making a contextual next step offer to someone who is actually interested in solving the problem, but knowing that these knowledge bases are written for existing users by the technical writers that write them. People who land up on them but have never used the product then have to they have some level of cognitive load to then go back to the website and then go through a flow to sign up, when you could just simply say, sign up here, go to the actual sign up page, and you'll see a boost in sign up just from doing that. It might take you an hour or two of effort to actually make this happen. And then you might want to create an SOP to make sure that your technical writers in the future adopt this. Is this helpful, by the way? Stop dropping yes in terms of, I want to go from like super high level to like eye level tactical with you to give you something that you can end up doing. I see a nice thumbs up coming in over here. So this is resonating. Good. Now let's talk about sort of deep versus shallow. That's something that Eric and Pep asked us to focus on. The thing that you can do instead of getting spread thin across all of these different areas is you really want to have depth in a deep level of GitHub immersion. And so if you don't have a GitHub profile, you should have one. I mean, I would imagine most of you do. But often what we see is partially filled out, partially active GitHub profiles. So if you have a developer evangelist within your company, they're the directly responsible individual or individuals that would take part in actually maintaining that GitHub instance, for example. There's so much you can do with it, frankly. It's beyond just putting in repositories. It's creating discussions. It's creating sponsorships. It's linking to open source code bases, for example. All of those things add a ton, essentially. Let's go to the next step. I want to make sure that we cover a lot over here. So that's for product aware people, right? So if they know the name of your business and you're getting some branded search, or they're getting to the end of the awareness cycle from awareness consideration to pre-purchase, essentially, then the next step is like, what if they know what their problem is, but they're solution aware? They just don't know that your product exists, essentially. And so I'll give you a couple of things you can do over here. So certainly if you're doing events, the best way to get somebody to get very solution aware of the set of solutions in a given market for observability or data security or cybersecurity training or whatever it is that you really focus on is creating an event with a specific purpose. And a hackathon would be a common one, that you can start creating and promoting, frankly. It works better than a webinar, especially because of the concentrated nature of a 1 or 2 day kind of event. But hopefully that's self-explanatory in terms of, if you aren't doing this, do this, because it gets people to quite literally go from being problem aware to being solution aware. It's not a direct response playbook. It's a brand building and goodwill playbook. But if you have a product that really stands on its own 2 feet, people will kind of lean in from over there. Integration pages, that's an SEO play. And so one of the things about integration pages we see missed often, and we have a playbook for this. If you search Powered by Search integration pages on Google, you'll find our playbook associated with it, is a lot of the times integration pages are broadly, your app plus an integration of some kind. And it usually will only rank for people who are both aware of your platform name and the platform that they're trying to integrate with. What you want to do is really have a platform that you integrate with plus a use case, essentially. So I'll give you a business example, and then I'll give you a technical example. So if you put in Salesforce call recording integration, then what you might expect to find on the results page are integrations with Fireflies or Grain or any of these note-taking apps. But notice that it's not Salesforce Grain integration. So it's the name of the platform that you integrate with, essentially, or the platforms per page, but the use case matters over here. So if you have a solution that, again, is a test automation deployment CI/CD solution, for example, you would essentially put in the integration app that you connect to, plus CI/CD integration. And that will help you show up in Google for people who are looking for what you do, but may not be aware of who you actually are. And so that's an example of an SEO play that's very, very specific. Certainly open source repos, this is something that you can't control directly as a marketer, but it's a product strategy overall. If you see really the open source is eating the world right now, certainly in the last few weeks, we've seen what happened with DeepSeek, for example, and its impact on open source and how it's been adopted by a large number of companies since then, including like Perplexity, for example, is running its reasoning engine off DeepSeek. Architecture diagrams, if you don't know what those are yet, those are important because they actually get linked to and shared. And you think about sort of the dark social bits of where somebody might share your content in a Slack channel. What makes that particular piece of content engaging to click on is the link preview. It's not just that somebody dropped it in. So inherently, it has to be interesting and useful. But if you put in an architecture diagram into a piece of content, when that actually gets shared in something like Slack, it blows up and essentially takes up more virtual real estate. So that's an important part of it. And the last bit is bottom of funnel conversion ads, specifically on paid search. So think Google paid search works really, really well over here. This is for somebody who's looking for a category plus software, essentially, right? So CI/CD, tools, for example, enterprise observability platform, those types of searches. They're often actually done, a little bit sort of higher up in the organization in terms of the org structure specifically. And so the buyer on the other side of the screen resembles or acts a little bit more like a business buyer than a technical buyer. And so they're often on a recon mission and they'll bring in the rest of their team to start testing it. That's a top-down motion. The others are this is a bottoms up motion, meaning like you're going from the individual contributor into them promoting it to the rest of their team. On the problem aware side, going again, just to zoom out, we're going this way, right? That's the direction that we're really going through this. What we want to do over here is create how-to content. If you don't have a lot of how-to content, how to integrate Next.js with your solution, for example, that's the kind of how-to content I'm actually talking about. I'll show you some examples in a second as well. Boot camps and then awareness ads. Awareness ads with really no sign-up call to action. It's literally about getting awareness to your technical documentation because that is the experience that developers actually seek. And then finally, on the unaware side, if you have a shallow GitHub presence, then this is where you'll get stuck. You can create what is content. I wouldn't focus to major on it, although it can, we have seen large deals come in through the what is content that we create. What is content is also prime for AI generated content, by the way, as well, because you can start creating it at scale, put in a human editor or human in the loop in the process and starts getting better. Lightning talks. We shouldn't ignore the second largest search engine on the planet, which is YouTube. Lightning talks are usually 5 to 10 minutes long. Perfect length for a developer. You want a barbell strategy where either it's really short, like 5 to 10 minutes, or it can be super long, like 2 hours, basically, an entire tutorial. And then finally, meetups. So this is your DevOps engagement matrix in terms of the type of content you might do on product aware, solution aware, problem, and then unaware. It gives you a really nice framework to be able to say, if we're not doing the stuff on the top right side of the screen, then we shouldn't be doing the stuff on the bottom right. So the way that you really want to work through this in terms of prioritization is to say, how good are our API docs? If we haven't done them, then we should do it. If we're not doing anything to bring people back to our site, we should do some retargeting. If we haven't made our code samples really robust, let's do that. If we haven't included CTAs in our knowledge base, don't move on to any of these other areas until you do the area preceding it. Does that make sense? If yes, just give me a quick thumbs up so I make sure this is resonating with you. That's your prioritization matrix, not just what to do, but when to do it, essentially, as well. Awesome. All right, let's keep trucking along. I want to give you very quick snapshots of what to do in each section, basically, right? So if you look at one of our clients at Elastic, a deep GitHub presence is one of the things that you want to aspire towards. So not only is a lot of stuff basically going on, it's relatively recent. So you can sort of see that their deployments on their repo are, 6 hours ago, 4 days ago. I took the screenshot last night. And so you can start seeing over here that this is something that is a core congregation point for developers, really, at the end of the day. You may not yourself be spending a bunch of time on GitHub if you're the marketer trying to reach developer audiences, but developers certainly are spending a lot of time over there. And so making sure that you have a lot of jumping off points from your content to that GitHub profile is important, because again, going back to that old UX book, Steve Krug wrote a book called Don't Make Me Think. What we really want over here is just to lay down little sort of breadcrumbs, if you will, to the places that matter. GitHub is part of the consumer journey or the buyer journey for any developer or DevOps organization. So if you don't have it, or you're not linking enough to it, the thing you can do as a marketer is to have more inroads to discovery specifically over there. If yours is underdeveloped, you can advocate so that it becomes better developed. If you have API documentation, here's, I think, API documentation from Stripe, which is probably the gold standard, I would say, in terms of what you really want to aspire towards. But API docs that come in from over there, mostly I'm showing these as a function of these rank well, they get lots of traffic. And if you think about what best in class basically looks like, I've included a couple of examples over here. Keep dropping in questions as you think about how to improve your GitHub presence, your API documentation, as this should start giving you some inspiration, and some Q&A should start popping up. Code samples. So if you think about sort of Docker and the way that they do it, they have a large overview of code samples broken down by use case. So for databases, for platforms, and you can kind of just go down and say, if I'm a MongoDB user, show me all your code samples for integrating Docker specifically in there. The other one that's really interesting to look at is what we call a live sandbox environment. So this is from Code Sandbox. Sandbox environments for technical buyers are basically the same as live demos for B2B buyers specifically. And so if you've ever seen a Novatic type demo where you didn't have to talk to a salesperson, you could literally just play with the app within a web interface. This is really what we're talking about. But for our technical audience, if you want to check out what Code Sandbox basically has done, they actually have essentially a full IDE in here, essentially, right? So the development environment is one that you can start seeing even before you sign up. And the idea is you get to try it before you even try it. I'm sure you've heard of try before you buy, but this is try before you try, frankly. And so what we're doing over here is really giving, again, more autonomy to the user. How-to content. Atlassian has got an example over here. So, if you Google the term Git checkout, really the how-to content is both, sometimes it is quite literally how to blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it's just, Git checkout, right? Which is a 1 to 3 phrase type of term, and you have content specifically around that. These pieces of content over here, they're fairly deep, so this screenshot doesn't do full justice to this. I just wanted to give you very quick snapshots essentially associated with that. But this is deep. This piece of content was probably 2,000 words. Then what is content? So what is content is what it sounds like. So what is KNN? Here's another one from Elastic. And you can see it's a nearest neighbor definition. This particular type of content, by the way, is good for showing up in LLMs. And so we often are getting asked the question now, how do I show up in ChatGPT or Perplexity or in, insert LLM over here? And our answer is a little bit anticlimactic, which is, you need to actually do well from a Google SEO perspective in order to do well from an LLM perspective, because the crawlers work exactly the same way. In fact, the one core difference for LLMs that's even more important than in Google right now is the number of times somebody links and mentions your content on a third-party website. So an inbound link or an inbound mention is something that LLMs are looking at more deeply. So if you're in one of those people also mention sections on Google Knowledge Graph, then you'll do better essentially over there. Let's see. Let's go to, there's a few other pieces that I want to show you. Architecture diagrams. These are wonderful to work with for product managers. This one's from Azure specifically. This type of content gets linked to, it gets shared, it shows up in Slack channels. If you put this particular link into Slack, it would show up to be quite large essentially and take up more virtual real estate. And then finally, you would have bottom of funnel, paid search. So this is for AWS, for example, that spends a ton of money on paid search. the types of paid search you want to focus on are not just branded, but non-branded. So, text-to-speech model, they have their whisper model, for example, type-to-speak, and so on, that you want to go, focus on. Now, I would encourage that if you don't have a ton of spend on paid search, if you're spending anywhere less than $20K per month, for example, on paid media and paid search, then you want to have really tight controls before you start expanding into terms that might be less focused on the intent of the user and exactly what the product specifically does. There's a time and place to expand your audience into people who are further away in the middle of the funnel or top of funnel. Generally speaking, if you're spending in that sort of lower bracket, essentially, this is not the right time. In fact, you'll just get false positives. You'll get a bunch of wasted spend and traffic, and you'll come to the conclusion that paid ads basically doesn't work for you. I want to give you a very quick primer on how to think about paid ads, since some of you are running it. This is our campaign blueprint that we use for Google Ads specifically. I'll just give you, again, just like a priority sequence to focus on. If you're not doing any paid ads at all, the areas to focus on are making sure that you don't get conquested by your brand's competitors. Essentially, if they're bidding on your brand name, they're squatting, then that's a problem. And certainly there's a lot of comparison content. So developers, I would say, even more than business buyers, tend to do a lot more comparative type of searches. They then go on areas that they trust more, like they'll go on our DevOps and Reddit, for example, or they'll go on Hacker News, they'll go into GitHub discussions. But the cool thing about this is that you can always start shaping and actually funneling some of that search content. This is really cheap to do, basically, to make sure that you just own your own brand and you don't have people squatting on your brand name. The next easiest thing to do is a remarketing segment. And ultimately, developers are still humans. They like to buy content in a way where if you show them the right type of material that they like engaging with, like the technical documentation, like the code samples, like the API docs, like testimonials from other people who look like them. Seth Godin has this quote: "People like us, people like us do things like this." You need to figure out what that is for your audience, and then put remarketing content in front of them. Don't just say sign up or request a demo, because that's exactly where they might miss out. Conquesting ads: if you have a truly superior product, you can run ads versus legacy on-prem, bigger competitors, for example, if you're like an upstart, and go with that. And then finally, the thing that most people think about with paid search is prospecting ads. These are these ads over here, which are non-branded. Somebody who's looking for, a category plus software kind of term. That's where we would spend most of the money to be able to get, a higher level of conversions, basically. Let me see if there's something else over here in terms of right next steps. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to give you, a couple of key things that to focus on, and then we can go into questions. So the first one in terms of principles is you want to kill gated content. Now, if it's really working for you, then do your thing. But in general, you're going to find that look at what happens after somebody fills out that particular form. So if you have less than a 1, 2, 3, 4% conversion rate on that gated content, then it's getting ignored by definition. So you should focus on killing it. It's not really the way that buyers want to buy for your market, and so we don't recommend including it. Make sure that you have your documentation is marketing. So if you really make your code samples, API docs, technical documentation, knowledge base more robust, it's going to work better for you. Put in those, calibrate the call to actions, which is the thing that a lot of you are probably missing on your sites right now. Like you've actually invested in documentation, but you haven't connected the dots in terms of calibrating call to actions. You want to make sure that you go deep on one channel. And if you could choose, I would say it would be GitHub. That might require some partnering with other people in the business to be able to make that actually happen. If you're a hop and a scotch away from actually doing things like participating on discussions on GitHub, releasing open source tools, for example, or updating your repository fairly often. And the last one I would say is that there's a messaging component over here that is probably not talked about enough. And so these are your, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 things to do that are your 5 next steps that can all ultimately lead to more pipeline, more signups, more MRR, more ARR down the other end. And I want to just give you a quick thing on your messaging. And so if you think about your different types of roles, you have your individual contributor, software engineer, developer type of role. You have your ops roles, which are typically somebody who's essentially coming in. They may have been a technical IC in the past, but now fundamentally they're managing more people and tools and processes. And then you might have the leadership roles. In terms of product messaging, one of the things we've seen work quite well is being able to say, hey, so if you're a developer, what you want to focus on in terms of your messaging is here what makes it powerful. This is an element that really matters to developers. It does not matter to ops whatsoever. So the message for ops is here's what makes it reliable. And so the typical kind of conversation goes something like, hey, I found this great open source tool. It reduces our latency, for example. We can start essentially making things a lot more efficient and better. It requires less calls, or API costs or cloud costs will go down. And ops might say, we just renewed our contract with Datadog. I'm not ready to look at this until next quarter or until the end of the year. And that's because they're looking for certainty as opposed to just, is it the best, essentially. And then the leadership teams usually want to make, they're looking at here's what makes it a safe choice. So if you can kind of see over here, the avant-garde kind of component of it is the developer, the IC roles. The ops roles are about reliability. And then the leadership roles focus on, is it safe? Because they might have specifically, they're engineering the whole ship to turn slowly towards being able to say, how do I make this so that we hit our company level goals, not just our team or divisional goals specifically? And so I'll just kind of mention that in terms of the product messaging specifically. And I think with that, maybe we have some time for quick questions, if that's cool. I'll keep the screen share going in case I need to draw, but Eric or Martha, do you want to come on and we can kind of focus on some questions? I can't hear you for some reason, Eric.
Now you can hear me.
I can hear you now. Yep.
That was weird. Not sure what the problem was there. I had to cycle the mic off and on. Okay, Zach's question has been behind the scenes, but it got voted up to the top. So we'll start with Zach's, even though it wasn't asked first. Is there any nuance you've seen when marketing to mainly enterprise customers and solutions that are very complex or technical?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so if you think about sort of the divide, right, and we were to draw a line over here and say there's something that is kind of more startup focused and more enterprise focused, I would say that there's a couple of ways to slice that. If you think about what's different, the platforms are different. The buying committees are different in enterprise, right? And then finally, you end up having sort of the sales cycle is very different. So versus in startup, right? So this is a super fast cycle, less decision makers. This might be an IC actually even deciding, or just one or two people. And then the platforms over here are usually the newer as opposed to the older platforms. So what we look for in terms of the nuance is showcase that you integrate with all the platforms that really matter, that are mission critical. If you're selling to a buying committee, make sure you have content for each role in that buying committee, right? So you might end up having, for example, somebody who's a sponsor, but then you might have somebody who's a gatekeeper. And kind of going back to this messaging over here, if you just have one track of messaging, which is our stuff is really cool and powerful, then that's what kind of kills the enterprise deal. But if you say, you know what, it's actually really powerful, ops teams love it, and frankly, so does the C level essentially as well. But if you just say that, we think we're saying that, if you can actually adopt the voice of the customer through, really calibrated, well architected testimonials, block quotes, remarketing ads, for example, little risk reversals like near your sign up forms underneath, you actually have a persona such as a gatekeeper or like a sponsor, for example, over there. Those are all things that improve the conversions. It's really anticipating every single blocker or objection that might come up in the actual process, going from somebody evaluating the product to activating and using it and adopting it throughout the entire organization. And you want to essentially then, take these particular things that might pop up and say, well, if I were to run a customer journey for my sales cycle from awareness to purchase, right? What are all the steps in the middle that might end up happening? And essentially what we're doing over there is saying, well, the gatekeeper seems to come in, post product demo, or they seem to come in at the end of the free trial, for example. So you might want to then consider what kind of in-product messaging, what kind of email, what kind of, even direct response outreach do we want to do to essentially get ahead of the questions. And so the way that we've seen that nuance work is to say, hey, our solution does X. We frequently get, these questions from Y types of gatekeepers. They ask these 3 top points. Are any of those important to you? And just like I asked at the beginning over here, right, when we went further down, I said, of these 3 things, which of those are problems for you? And you guys said all 3, or you said 2. It's the same idea. Essentially, rather than waiting for your prospects to say, here are all the challenges I see with adoption, you say, well, people like you have problems like this. Is that you? And you say yes, or they say yes. And then you go, here are some ways that other customers have actually solved that problem. So rather than saying we're awesome, you're essentially saying, these types of personas on the buying committee seem to like our solution for these specific reasons in their own voice, essentially. So that's where the nuance really comes in. Is that helpful?
Awesome. That was a really in-depth question. So thank you. Another one that came up kind of on the fly, someone mentioned in the chat, and then it was asked as a question, is best practices and examples on embedding CTAs within documentation. You noted, so folks have a knowledge base. They can have CTAs that call back. So just looking for some examples or best practices there.
I think with the time we have, I'm just going to give you like a first principles version basically of it. So if I draw a typical knowledge base, right? So you have basically a sidebar with like table of contents, right? Going down over here, you have the title of whatever the knowledge base topic basically is. And then usually what you'll end up having is some text and like an image, and then whatever text and image over here. What we find is that users who are using your stuff will go through the whole thing because like literally they're getting stuck, right? The thing that we recommend is to say, well, why don't we actually insert a nice little box over here, and it quite literally just says not a user yet, sign up today, and put this, or see it in action, right? Like you can use, we call that, there's a book called Demand Side Selling, which is by a guy called Bob Moesta. The general kind of concept around it is sell what the buyer wants to do, not what you want to do. So instead of just saying sign up today, which is fine, but if you then connect it and say, put this playbook into action or connect these apps together, it actually completes their desire for why they're on that article in that first place. And so that's essentially what we're talking about over here, which is just put this box in and see magic essentially happen. That box, by the way, the higher up in the article it is, the more response it'll get from people who are not users, because fundamentally they're not going to go scroll through the entire to the end. Essentially what they're doing is saying, I have a use case. This knowledge base article seems to indicate that this platform helps me complete this use case. I'm not ready to actually go through the whole thing because I'm not a user yet. I'm going to hop back to the marketing website and see if I want to evaluate it further. And then they're going to get a Slack message and get distracted and leave. So that's exactly what happens in real life. What we want to do is say, before they get distracted by their next meeting or whatever kind of draws away their attention, if you're not a user and they're like, yeah, I'm not, then sign up, right? And then if you want to add in extra context, here's why, essentially, is what we're saying over there.
We're at time, so I'm going to lightning round you the last 3 questions, and we can make sure that we get the recording out to people who have to jump off. They can see this. So
For sure.
quick questions, quick answers. So question number 1 is, how do you handle GitHub presence with limited or unwilling technical resources?
You can't. I mean, you have to advocate basically for it, right? It's the same as like if your developer teams, if your marketing sites controlled by your developer teams and they won't give you airtime, you just have to advocate for it. So be the grown up in the room and say, we can't make the progress that we want with our end market until we actually have it. So how do we allocate resources towards building a deeper GitHub presence?
Yeah, you've probably seen some of your marketing clients as well contribute money to dev resources, saying, I'm just going to buy outside dev resource, some internal resource time as well.
100%.
Yep. Tips on getting, we just did that. If you're focused mainly on retention and cross-sell of a pretty big install base, what's your take on community forums, and how can I incorporate your advice to my existing forum?
Great question. So it reminds me of a client that we work with called Macrometa. They hired a developer evangelist. We work with that particular evangelist to help them basically figure out which community forums to go into and what specific kinds of threads as well. The key is that, of course, you can't jump in and do that for them. And so the prerequisites are have a developer evangelist, figure out which forums, go deep on one instead of going shallow on a couple.
Yeah, I love that. Depth and create that trust, right, on one rather than just spray and pray all over the place. All right, 100%. The last one is, if you could share how to get commitment from upstairs to get internal dev team to provide you content, what would you do or say to get that commitment?
Here's what I would do. If you're not recording conversations you're having that sales engineers, for example, are having, or that account execs are having, start doing those. You can easily take the transcripts and mine them for the questions that prospects are asking that you do not have content for. So the pitch really is, our customers are literally asking us questions that we cannot answer, that we're answering one-to-one in Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever the hell kind of screen share you're basically doing. And we do not have a one-to-many piece of content that answers that. Would you like to save time with your sales engineers and have them work on stuff where they're not just communicating onesie-twosie? And the answer is yes, and we should create this particular content. But the gist is really, it's not, I think it's important. Our customers are literally asking us questions that we do not have a piece of content to answer.
Love it. Make sure you arm yourself first before you bring this argument, and you're going to have a lot more success. Dev, thank you so much for sharing. This has been an amazing hour. I will package all of this together. I think as well, you mentioned you have some resources for the resource section as well. I'll collect those from you by email, get the slides stuff you've created, send it all out to everybody. If you want to find Dev, poweredbysearch.com, and also you can grab them on LinkedIn. It's Dev Basu, DEVBASU on LinkedIn. Otherwise, thanks. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you later.
Awesome chatting with you guys. Cheers.